Okay, well, the time is 6:04, and in an interest of time, and to be respectful of everyone's time this evening, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Magali Sanchez. I am the Chief Family Advancement Officer here at Boston Public Schools. I'm very excited to be with you this evening, and I want to start by thanking you all for your incredible support of your school communities and taking on this very important role. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about applying a racial equity lens to the BPS hiring process. And I am joined by Dr. Jose Lopez, our Legal Director of Compliance and Civil Rights, as well as joined also by Rashawn Martin. He is our Managing Director of Recruitment, Cultivation, and Diversity. In addition, I'm also joined by Lisette Santiago. She is our Family Engagement Facilitator for Region 7. And Eli Savi, who is the Director of Data and Marketing for the Office of Family and Community Advancement, which I have the opportunity to lead with Chief Ortiz and Deputy Tavares, who are not with us this evening. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge Patrick Vale, who's with us from the Department of Academics to help us answer any questions that you all may have. And again, we thank you for your dedication. Next slide, please. So these are the objectives for this evening's training. We're going to take the opportunity to review the benefits of a racially and ethnically diverse school and district staff. We will also discuss best practices for applying affirmative anti-racist hiring and retention practices, including every stage of the selection process. We will also introduce a menu of supports and practical skills and replicable training to enable schools and offices to be able to access, select and retain a diverse workforce. In addition to that, the participants this evening will have an opportunity to ask us any questions that you may have, which we'll be happy to answer. At this time, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Lopez. Jose?
Thank you, Chief. And so we'll start off with this just icebreaker and opening question. Want to throw this out to the group. You can respond either by writing in the chat or just taking yourself off mute and responding to it. So we want to know, does race matter when we talk about hiring, when we talk about the school district, when we talk about the work that we do here? Does racial and ethnic demographics of our district and of our school staff matter? And if so, tell us why. While folk are gathering their thoughts, I'll share with you that in my experience, it absolutely does matter and it has mattered. I had my first Black educator in middle school, and that was Mr. Johnson. And I remember him. I remember that course. I remember the lessons there, and I've carried those with me throughout. And so I noticed as a student, I remember when it happened. I remembered his name. And it took me until I got to the 7th grade to encounter my first Black educator. Um, Thank you for adding your comments in the chat. Someone writes, yes. Yes, as we want our staff to mirror our student demographics. Completely agree with that. Makes a lot of sense. Yes, children need to see themselves in the teachers and staff around them. Absolutely. I've heard that from children. I've heard that from other staff. I believe it matters. Having personal understanding of students' cultures is important, as is representation. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Um, we have folks that are echoing those comments. Yes, students need to see someone who looks like them. Absolutely. Again, that was my experience. Of course, it does. Students need to relate culturally with their educators. Absolutely. Yes, children need to see themselves, but also caring adults come from everywhere. Absolutely. Definitely agree with that for sure. +1 to all of these. Yes, 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 agreed. Again, if you want to share your voice rather than type, you can take yourself off of mute and do that. But another yes, agree. Please continue to add your comments and bring them into the discussion. It's a good opportunity, I think, to orient us to the training that you're about to receive. And definitely good to hear people's voices because we'll spend a lot of time kind of sharing information with you all.
Yes, I want to, hi, it's Shayna Holloway. I want to say yes, kind of echoing and agreeing with everything that is said. I definitely think it is important that children and staff see themselves, but most importantly, children can see themselves in the leadership role, because as we know throughout the district, a lot of times when children see themselves, especially African American, Black staff, it's mostly in a disciplinary role. And it's never really always like oh, they can run the school, we can be in charge, but it's kind of they're the person that comes when I'm having a meltdown. They're the one who has to, like, walk with me, calm me down, but just someone who can be in charge. I think it's important that they see themselves in that role and not just disciplinary or as like a lunch mother, a monitor, or like a recess monitor, but you know, someone running a school. I think it's also very important.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Absolutely agree. I remember my experience sort of knowing who was in charge of my school and who wasn't, and the roles that they played. And students know that too, right? It's they pick up on it, they understand those dynamics. And it's wonderful when they know that Mr. Lopez is someone who has authority, and it's not just dealing with me when I'm, presenting as a problem or I'm having a difficulty. He's an important voice in the school community, and he's respected. Absolutely true. Someone else added, yes to all of this, and the research on this is clear. Students have stronger positive sense of self and stronger academic outcomes when they have teachers whose racial and ethnic identities align with their own. Thank you for lifting that up. There is research on that for sure, and some of that is included in our presentation today, and you'll be able to access it. I do want to create another 30-second space for someone else to share and get off mute. You don't have to, but I'll create the space, and then afterwards we'll close this section out and move on with the presentation.
Hello, everyone. I believe that race and our ethnic background matters because we have a sense of who we are, where we want to go, and how we may shape future policies and the education of our children, which are the future. So it provides a sense of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you so much for
You're
sharing that.
welcome.
And with that, Chief, I'll close out this section. And thank you so much for lending us your voices, your thoughts, your insights. It really is valuable. And we'll move on to slide 4, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Rashawn.
All right, good evening, everyone. So for the next segment of this session, we're going to just get in a little bit of the data and background that kind of grounds our work and the work of the district. We start with the research, and which shows the impact of our educators of color. And we know that, a diverse staff and staff diversity improves academic outcomes for all of our students. Pertains to test scores, attendance, suspension, graduation rates, all of those outcomes and that data and for our students is affected, when we have a diverse staff. And the research is clear, right? That Black students in all grades, if they have at least one Black teacher, they're less likely to experience, any form of discipline. And if you're a Black child, and we even found, if you're a student of color, if you have just one Black teacher, or another teacher of color, that's of your own race or ethnicity, you're more likely to graduate and enroll in college. And it actually goes significantly higher if you have more than two. I had my first Black teacher when I was in grade 6 at the UMANA. And I actually was blessed to have, a decent amount of Black educators while during my time 7 through 12 at the Boston Latin School. Next slide, please. All right, so we know what the challenge is, and these challenges is what grounds the work of the Boston Public Schools. Partly, it's about systemic racism, and systemic racism forms barriers to hiring, retention of employees. And so we're constantly thinking about every phase of the process, including this phase, right? So who goes to college, out of our schools, who gets selected to, to receive, to get an interview and then obviously ultimately get hired, who passes the exams, right? Because we know that the intel as a standardized test can be barriers, especially for our educators of color or our candidates where maybe English is not their first language. So we as a school system and you all as hiring committees, we're charged to counteract the impacts, all right, of racism, all right, by applying aggressive, innovative interventions at every stage of the process. And one of those interventions is by having people sit in spaces like these to talk about, talk about equity and biasness in our hiring process. Next slide. All right, so what's it look like out there in the free world? Well, we have a quarter of the state's educators of color right here in the Boston public schools. 41% of the state's Black teachers, 18% of the state's Latinx teachers, and 22% of the state's Asian teachers, sit here in the Boston public school. So we don't have a massive, slice of the, of the pie. So the overall, right, it's just a quarter, all right, but we still have, a good majority of all the educators of color here in the district, right here in the BPS. And of course, we believe that even we still don't have enough to meet the needs of the students that we serve. But I will say these numbers have shifted over the years because you will find through things like the Educator Diversity Act, which is recently passed up in the State House, that you're going to have more and more of our school districts, are getting more and more committed to diversifying their school districts also. All right, next slide. So this is what our current overall workforce racial diversity stands here in the district. This is a report that the Office of Human Resources brings to the school committee every fall. So this is all public information. You can find the entire sort of State of the Union report on the school committee website on the Boston Public Schools homepage. But this gives you the breakdown of our staff. You'll see the reference. So first of all, we're certainly happy that we've been able to increase by a full percentage point, our overall workforce diversity from 56 to 57%, compared to last school year. When we look at the different categories, when you reference the Garrity educators that talks about our classroom teachers, and our school counselors, we monitor those roles specifically because we still try, we're still working to get back to above what was an original order by Judge Garrity that, that 25% of our teachers and school counselors should be Black or African American. Right now, we're at 22.6. Right. But 42% of the staff of the teachers of color, and school counselors across the district are, identify as a person of color. Our school leaders, more than half of them are diverse. All right. When you see non-Garrity school budgeted staff, that means everyone who's in your school building who's not a classroom teacher or the school counselor. So that's or the school leader. Right. So that's the secretary, right? That's the assistant principals, the instructional coach, the social workers, the family liaisons, right? So all the people who work in your school building, all right, who are not teachers, school counselors, or school leaders are in this non-Garrity school budgeted staff. And close to 70% of them are people of color. And then the central office always has been relatively historically diverse, 60%. And then there's the whole district. So a little more than half of our close to 12,000 employees are people of color. Next slide. All right, and here's a snapshot of our school leaders, all right, which is very important for us specifically. So 66 of our 118 school leaders, all right, here this current school year identify as a person of color. 40 of them speak at least one of our official languages in the BPS, right, in addition to English. They're a very smart group, as 41 of them have masters or doctorates. I'm sure you've come across a bunch of them in your, even in your schools. All right, and we know that good schools, need consistent leadership, and so we're happy that 27 of them have been a leader for at least, for at least 10 years. My kids went to the Otis in East Boston where we live, and both of my daughters, went there, K1 through 6, and they had one school leader, and now they're in the 10th and 8th grade, and the same school leader is still there. So really thrilled by that longevity. All right, next slide, please. All right, so then in addition to our thinking about our racial and ethnic diversity, we also have begun to focus in these last several years on our linguistic diversity. So we value, right, the hiring and retention, of linguistically diverse staff, right? Because we have students and families who speak all sorts of languages, in addition to English. And we know a lot of the families of our students, I mean, where, English might not even be their first language. And so we're trying to find more and more adults, who can speak the languages that our families speak. So we got a little bit of a push on that, from the 2017, what's called Look Act, the language opportunity for our kids, really requiring districts to hire more educators that are fluent in the languages other than English. So we're certainly, looking at that, and certainly folks who are capable of even teaching, our students, primary languages in bilingual settings. All right. So increasing the percentage of educators fluent in our languages is a key priority for the district. Next slide. All right, so this is how our classrooms and our school counselors hold up right now in terms of linguistic diversity. All right, so we saw that we got a big jump, coming out of the pandemic, and then it slowed down some, but it's going in the right direction. All right, so we've had, an increase of 1%, from last year, and a 4 percentage point gain since 2022. So we're continuing to just drive that, to have that number go up. So the fact that we're closing in on almost half of the teachers, that we hired into the district this past year, it's the 677, 47% of them, or close to half of them spoke at least one of these languages here listed. So we're thrilled about that, and of course we continue to want to do more. Next slide. All right, so that gives you an idea of the data. All right, and the data tells a story about where the district is and where the district is trying to go, and so hopefully it gives you your own sort of feedback and sort of grounding in terms of your current hiring work for your own schools. Schools have diversity hiring goals, that they're provided with, by the Office of Human Resources that you can have access to. And like I said, the full presentation of what I would call sort of the state of the district can be found on the school committee website. And I'll turn it back over to Jose. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rashawn. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about implicit bias. And I want to talk about first, why would we talk about implicit bias? And it's because when it comes to hiring practices, implicit bias can be a source of barriers when it comes to finding the right candidates for positions, historically a barrier to diversifying the workforce. And so we want to talk about what implicit bias is. We'll talk about how it impacts hiring, and then we'll talk about how you can counteract implicit bias. And so, Lisette, will you please get our first video ready? And when you review this slide deck on your own, there's a test at the bottom there that you can take on your own. We don't own the answers. We don't see answers to it. But particularly for those who are unsure how they might carry implicit bias, or what that looks like, or how does that even get assessed, you'll have fun taking that exam. It'll give you some insight into some biases that you carry. I took it, and even I was surprised at the results. It lets you take it in a whole variety of areas. And so I chose an area that I just wasn't familiar with in terms of my own self-assessment. So you have a lot of options. And again, it's not connected to the district. It's completely private, but I encourage you to look at it. And with that, we'll start this first video.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an overrepresentation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but we're biased.
Thank you, Lisette. I do want to create a space after each of these videos, spend about a minute, just open it up for some initial reactions, comments, questions. This is really an opportunity to make this training a little more interactive. So would anyone like to start us off with maybe an initial reaction or a thought that they had as they watched that short clip?
Well, I will say, yesterday when they told us like we had to do a bias training, I was excited because I realized like every day we do have like just naturally as humans we carry biases. Like our experiences have shaped us, our thinking, and how often do we stop to be like, oh, maybe I'm thinking biasly, like you don't really. So I think it's important that we are discussing it because even as educators, right, like we have to think about the biases that we bring into the classroom every day when we're looking at students. And so then it's natural that we may have that when we think about a leader. Picking a school leader, we all have things that are important to us in our everyday. And so we're going into it probably wanting someone who is on the same page as us, but that doesn't mean we should discredit someone who maybe doesn't say the thing that is number one on our list. You know what I mean? So like just being aware of that, or how we're viewing someone as they're, applying for the position.
Thank you so much. Those of you who are reviewing applicants, you are going to have multiple applicants that you're going to review, and you have limited amount of time. And those conditions are the perfect conditions where implicit bias can sort of start to take control or weed its way into a hiring process. And so important that we talk about implicit bias. Thank you so much for sharing that. Anyone else like to share?
Hello. Yes, so to piggyback, implicit bias, it's somewhat a negative influence that one may have, and it's also connected to our socioeconomic status, educational background, perceptions, and I think that it had excluded diversity and sort of the self-value and what someone may be able to bring to the table. So having these conversations allow the dialogue to see things for what they are and have a better understanding as to how we may shape our future with more inclusive policies, procedures that will benefit all of us. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you. Really appreciate that. Someone else added in the chat, I do believe everyone has some form of implicit bias, but feel it will vary according to how you were raised and the area you grew up in. And I think that's absolutely true. I've been able to visit different parts of the country, and different parts of the country, different regions have different biases. They have different cultural norms, expectations. And it's something that, for those of you who have traveled elsewhere, you start to see, oh, it's not the same thinking or way of life necessarily here in Boston. And so definitely agree. Someone else said that everyone has a different level of awareness of their own biases and openness to exploring their biases. And that's absolutely true. And I do appreciate all of you for entering today's session with an open mind and open heart to talk about this and be a part of this training, because you are going to be involved in a hiring process. And so it's important for us as a district to make sure that you all have all of the tools that you need to be free from implicit bias and everything else, and choose candidates that are really going to serve your students and your schools as best as they could. Anyone else before we turn to the next video? I'll hold it open for 5 seconds.
Yeah, I would just add that it's important to be aware that our implicit bias can cut beyond ethnicity and race. There's age, there's size, there's looking at someone's education and thinking, oh, they didn't go to such and such schools. So it comes in a lot of different ways. And again, it really is so much based on us as the individual and our own, almost like, I don't know if it's values, but our own set of thinking. So looking at people through our lens that is actually quite limited, and not looking more broadly at the individual.
Thank you so much for lifting up that it takes form in other areas. In the legal world, we call those protected classes. And so it happens with people around disability, and what you might think isn't an issue or isn't a concern or take something for granted, for someone else is not seen the same way, not experienced the same way. And so thank you for lifting that up. With your permission, if there's nothing else, I'll turn it back to Lisette to get us into the second video.
I'm going to end our series with a bit of hope, but also a bit of caution. First of all, researchers are just starting to figure this stuff out, but things are hopeful. There have already been really successful examples of people figuring out ways to counter biases.
Orchestras have historically had far more male musicians than they had female, and so some of the women started saying, well, I think there's bias. And of course the people listening to the auditions were very skeptical of that, so they put up a screen, and so they wouldn't see the gender of whoever was auditioning. At first, the screen didn't change the percentage of women versus men being hired particularly much. But someone noticed that before some of the people auditioning, there was a click, click, click sound. High heels.
And once they asked people to remove their shoes, things in orchestras got relatively equal. So though it takes experimentation and refinement to work things out, people are finding solutions. The caution is that with the complexities of the real world, dealing with implicit bias isn't going to be a magic cure-all that fixes everything. Implicit bias explains some of the difficulties we face around race, but isn't the only factor. But it is something that all of us should actively think about.
Thank you, Lisette. I get the pleasure of seeing faces, and I saw people smiling and people sort of nodding their heads, so I really can't wait to turn it over to you all, but we'll love to turn it over for another maybe 2 minutes and just get some feedback, responses to that video.
Hi. I will say I love the way that is stated, let's take off the shoes. So it's somewhat of implying sort of let us put the prejudice on the side and focus on the mission here. And that creates opportunities, dialogues, and room for growth. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else want to share a reaction? Some people have seen this before. If it was your first time, love hearing from people who have seen it for the first time, who are like, able to share. Someone put it was so appropriate that the musicians put meaning on sound. They were probably conscious of what they saw. Absolutely. And that probably had to do again with how they're interpreting their own bias and whether or not they even realize that it's connected to their profession. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else?
I think the example with the musicians and the screen and the high heels illustrates really effectively the idea that implicit bias isn't something you can just like rid yourself of, that there was a gap there between the explicit intention of the people selecting musicians for the orchestra and then the implicit behavior. And so the structures that ensure equitable consideration of candidates were the most important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you for that so much. I'm sure if you interviewed the folks making those hiring decisions for the orchestras, they would say, yeah, we're trying to find the best musicians, the right folk, but without that structure in place to be able to mitigate some implicit bias, the data was the data, and it showed that there was a significant change. And that's what we'll hopefully be also giving you today, just some structural support on how you can address that. I don't see anyone else who wants to chime in. 5 more seconds and then we'll move to the next video. Thank you. Lisette, if you could share the next video, please.
Let's look at how to measure bias in ourselves and in others. Here's Dolly Chuk from NYU.
We sent emails to real professors in real universities.
They contacted over 6,500 professors at random from 260 American universities.
We sent them an email that looked like it came from a real person asking for a meeting to learn more about the PhD program in that university. But we randomly assigned whether the fictional person sending that email had a name that sounded male or female and sounded white, Chinese, Hispanic, Indian, or Black. What we found that is if you were a white male, you were far more likely to receive a response back than if you were in all those other categories put together as a group.
Some of this could be explicit racism, but it's far more likely that in many cases these professors are just busy. They can't respond to every email they get, so they kind of let their subconscious decide for them. And that's where their biases come through. Research shows that our racial biases are often more about who we choose to help than who we don't, and we tend to help people who are similar to us. But you aren't 6,500 randomly selected professors, so how can you figure out where you might be making similar unconscious choices? First, there's a well-known test online you can take that can help show you biases you hold. Or
just do an audit. Whatever data you have, whether it's formal data in a computer or whether it's just data that's sort of anecdotal, look at the data. For example, I met this fantastic executive in Silicon Valley. He takes great pride in being someone who actively tries to achieve gender balance on his teams, knowing that Silicon Valley and tech are skewed heavily male.
So he looked at his professional social network, his Twitter, his LinkedIn.
He found his network was far more skewed male than he expected. So there's a place where he could actively work to shift that, and that's what he's been doing since then.
So this is not a scientifically exact self-audit, but it can still be useful, and you can audit anything. So maybe start by taking that online test for bias. Maybe check out whose emails you're replying to. But you can also audit yourself for implicit bias by asking a friend to observe you in the real world. If you're a teacher, have people look at who you call on most in class, whatever your interactions are.
One practical thing that people should do is take stock of their friends. It would be very useful for people to actually make lists of people with whom they spend time.
Look for patterns. That's the audit. That's the assessment we can all do.
Next time, some people say you should go out and make as many friends of different races as possible, but does that actually work?
Thank you, Lisette. Again, 2-minute space here to just get some feedback, comments. I'll turn it right over to you all. And thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. It makes this a lot more enjoyable and helps us get through it quicker.
I don't want to hog the mic, so sorry. But I think sometimes it can be hard when you think about or when you do the audit, um, to realize the bias you have, but it's important to do. But I can understand also at times it's uncomfortable when you think about it, especially when they mention like who are the kids you call on the most. And sometimes it's not even in a, you don't think of it in a negative way, but is it like I'm purposefully trying to call on students who like maybe need more time first or like can for sure give me this answer, right? Like, and you're thinking it's coming from a great place, but is there actually like a bias behind why you go to certain people? Um, so I think having the audit is definitely important. I'll probably take the test to, yeah, have this audit.
Well,
Thank
thank you for sharing. I remember as a classroom teacher, when I was teaching, one thing that I utilized was I would set a schedule for who I would call on in class, and I would tell the students in advance when their day was to kind of give them some time to prepare, to kind of know that I'm calling, Wednesday I'm calling on you, so just be prepared. Um, and that was a way that I made sure that I wasn't, at least in my classroom, doing the same thing, but building in time that everyone would be given an opportunity. So thank you for sharing. Someone wrote, I believe it starts with you. Like the video said, it's good to take an internal look at yourself and see where you can improve, or even ask a good friend if they see any bias that you may not even recognize within yourself. Absolutely. I encourage you to do this. The best part is we're not going to know. Like, this is private, this is in your life. And I do think that you'll find some joy in engaging in the topic and just learning more about yourself in that way. 5 more seconds and then we'll move on to the next slide. Great. Thank you all so much for your input and your willingness to lend your voices to the conversation. It really is appreciated. And so I'll just run through some of these definitions. These are other examples. There's a denial of bias. These are terms that you might have heard. They're out there. Someone might say, I'm colorblind. Employee race or ethnicity doesn't matter. We live in a post-racial society. It's not about race. She just doesn't fit here. The research demonstrates that people who claim to be colorblind are more likely to act on racial bias. And I would just want to pause for a moment and make sure that everyone understands that we're not saying that people who do that are racist. What we're saying is that there's an implicit bias at play there. And without realizing that they have some of it, people are more likely to act on that bias. And that's what this training is making sure that we address and talk about as you're in a position to get involved in a hiring process and you're evaluating candidates. Each of these links, by the way, link to articles that you'll have access to. And so we're not going to go through them now, but you'll have them, and feel free during your own time to look at them. I think you'll find them very, very valuable. Next slide, please, Lisette. These are some other forms of bias that are out there. Conformity bias, the pressure to agree with others. Research has shown that this happens a lot on hiring committees and a lot on jury pools, believe it or not. People who sit in juries and who are making decisions are dealt with conformity bias. I might be the only one who thinks Jose's not guilty. Everyone else is putting pressure. They want to go home. It's just another area that has a lot of research around it. Beauty bias, preferring traditionally attractive people. The halo effect, where someone's one positive quality would erase anything else. The horns effect, which is the inverse, one negative quality erases all of the positive about an individual. We also see that with history of a person. I heard Jose might have done this in the past, or someone told me something about Jose 5 years ago, and that's Jose forever, right? And Jose has not changed. That's who he is. Attribution bias, assuming accomplishment or failure is related to luck versus skill or effort. Random conclusions or correlations, forming an opinion based on one like or dislike. I've seen this in my career where someone says, oh, Jose, he's a good guy, without telling me anything else about Jose, but they expect for me to just agree that Jose's a good guy, and I'm supposed to assume and adopt all of their positive experiences just because they said that. intuition bias, relying on just an emotional response. And the link at the bottom there is how to address 12 types of bias in the workplace. Please feel free to look at that at your own time. Next slide, please. And I believe I'll turn this back to Rashawn, but thank you so much for your input during my portion. Rashawn?
I'm here. We do have some research here on the impact of a racially diverse hiring pool. So we can take a look at that. And this talks about why so few diverse candidates are hired from the Harvard Business Review.
Companies have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in diversity initiatives, yet roughly 85% of board members and executives are still white men. Despite our best intentions, there are still unconscious biases that make people reluctant to go against the status quo. One study looked at these biases in both controlled and real-world scenarios and found that the diversity of a candidate pool had a huge impact on who got the job. In one experiment, participants decided between 3 male finalists. If 2 were white and 1 was black, participants tended to choose a white candidate. But if 2 out of 3 candidates were black, they tended to choose a black candidate. In another experiment that looked at gender instead of race, participants had to decide between 3 equally qualified candidates up for the role of nurse manager. Even for a position that is stereotypically held by more women, participants tended to choose a man if men outnumbered women in the finalist candidate pool. You may think this is basic probability, but the numbers suggest otherwise. To confirm this, the researchers went outside of the lab and examined a real university's hiring decisions. They found that when there was only 1 woman or minority candidate in a pool of 4 finalists, they don't stand a chance of being hired. But that changes dramatically when there is more than 1. And the difference between having 1 and 2 women seems to be what matters. The odds of hiring a woman were about 79 times greater if there were at least 2 of them in the finalist pool, and the odds of hiring a minority were 193 times greater if there were at least 2 minority candidates in the finalist pool. And this effect held, no matter the size of the pool. Having only 1 woman or minority in a pool of finalists highlights how different he or she is from the norm, and decision makers often unconsciously associate difference with risk or even incompetence. Managers need to know that working to get just 1 woman or minority considered for a position might be futile. But if they can change the status quo of the finalist pool by including 2, then diversity has a fighting chance.
Great, thank you. So, so we bring up that video just to show the importance of your pool and the importance of you going through your entire pool, of you seeing how many diverse candidates that you have, encouraging your schools or your school leaders to reach out for more diverse candidates and really evaluating the entire, pool. Next slide. All right, so where do you come in these processes? All right, so we're at the point to where you're at, doing school-based school-based interviews. All right, you as the school hiring committee. All right, where you'll be as part of the process of helping your school, find their new staff. Next slide. All right. So the role of selection committees when you're hiring candidates, you want to prioritize diverse candidates. You want to think about questions that assesses people's cultural competence. Obviously as long as they pass the equity muster. All right. But we do think that's important. To understand sort of, where people are when it comes to cultural competency and how much they may know about your school and your school environment and the kids in which you serve. You want to actually counteract biasness and, You're starting that process by attending this, this training. All right. You always want to conduct and document a fair process, free of discrimination, making sure everyone gets the same has the same process, everyone has the same amount of time, everyone gets the same questions, everyone gets an opportunity to ask questions, of the committee. All those things are important. And then you want to save documents in one place. Now, it's helpful that we're a Google district. All right, there's massive room in the BPS, Google Drive, but you certainly want to have everything in one place so it can be referenced to and found if needed. Next slide. All right. So when you think about the communities that you're currently on, I always take the approach of when you look around the table, who's not there? All right. To make sure that your hiring committees are well represented. So you want to make sure that it's racially and ethnically diverse, that it's balanced when it comes to gender and gender identity. Make sure your process is ADA compliant. All right, and that it's accessible for all of your applicants that you're going to interview. All right. When you get around to discussing candidates and having decision-making conversations, make sure you have a process where all voices, and experiences can be, are considered around the table. All right. Making sure your members get to this training. A lot of you are here. There might be some people missing. They can have access to the video afterwards. Have a clear, defined selection criteria, which includes your cultural competence. All right, but you want to be sure that you have that you just have clarity and an agreement on what your selection criteria is. All right, and then have your interview questions, linked to that, criteria. And it's about tangible skills, right? The performance tasks people will have. And you want to have realistic hypothetical scenarios, right? Because, not everything that happens, in a school building is going to happen all the time. All right. So if you're going to give hypotheticals or scenarios, make sure that they're actually, realistic for your school community. All right, next slide. All right. So like we said, very important. Making sure that your process is ADA compliant. We have an entire accommodations team that they can reach out to, giving people questions in advance, providing slides in a PDF format, so that people with assistive software can use, and more time on the test. All right, next slide. All right, and I'm gonna have Jose talk about how we think about the types of questions that we use.
Thank you so much, Rashawn. Want to remind you folks that if you get wind of, or if an employee, excuse me, a candidate might be requesting accommodations, you should immediately reach out to the accommodations team at accommodations@bostonpublicschools.org. And we will provide that support to your hiring committee, to your hiring team. You do not have to own that on your own. You don't have to figure that out. That's just an instance where you send it to us, and we'll support you fully in working out what accommodations we'll give a candidate. What might that look like? Someone might ask, hey, are there going to be questions provided in advance? Or they might say, is there going to be a scenario that I have to respond to? Those might be hints that they're trying to deal with an accommodation. And you should feel free to let your committee know, hey, we got this communication. We want to respond, and just be honest and say, yes, these are parts of the process, because someone who might need an accommodation then knows what to expect, and they can voice whatever accommodation that they need. I want to talk about unlawful questions. Make sure that you review the document about unlawful questions. I'll just share some that happen often in hiring processes, where someone is usually not intending to be discriminatory, but it's just an inappropriate question. The one that is said most often is, tell us about your family, right? And usually that's given out as an icebreaker, like, oh, tell us about your family. And the concern there is that it's an unlawful question. them having a family or what kind of family they have or who the members of the family are, how many family members. None of that is relevant to the job. None of that is pertinent to whether or not they can perform the job and can set the district up later on to then have to defend itself for some case that alleges discrimination. So stay away from that question. What happens if an employee starts talking about their family? Just listen and thank them for sharing and keep it moving with the lawful questions and the questions that you have already planned. I encourage you to just stay away from the back and forth about family. Again, you can, just not during the hiring process, please. Other unlawful questions that I hear all the time. Um, oh my God, like, how old are you? You look so young. And people say it again as a compliment. They mean it. There's no ill will behind it, but it is an unlawful question. Age is irrelevant. We don't want to bring that into the conversation, particularly at this stage. And so stay away from it. That document has other questions for you to review. And it doesn't just tell you what are stay away questions. It gives you some samples of ones that, you should be asking. Um, the second is to apply a consistent rating system. My department has gone through hiring. On my hiring committee, we set up a meeting and we talk about the questions that we want to ask, and then we create a rubric. What is a 4-star answer to this question? What are we looking for? And we start with the best one, because from the number 4, then you can come up with the 3, the 2, the 1, and a 0. And that really allows your team members, your committee members to, number one, keep track of how they're making these decisions, which is helpful evidence to prove that you weren't being discriminatory. And it also gives people a framework to deal with interviewing 7 phenomenal people. And you're trying to find differences between them. You're trying to find the right one. It's going to be hard for you to remember everything. And so using a consistent rating system, using a rubric are all ways to make sure that the process is non-discriminatory, that we can prove it, and also a way to support your panelists that are interviewing these folk. That's your screen, that's your removing the heels, right? It's creating these types of structures in place. And we talked about structures early on. Make sure you're assessing job related skills, not interviewing skills. Many times people will say, "What'd you think about Jose?" "Oh, he was great, but he such a bad interviewer." Okay, but what is Jose, or how did Jose perform on the questions that we asked? Did he answer the questions? Did he tell us what he would do in this situation? Did he give us his experience working with students? That's really what you want to bring the conversation back to. And then hold discussion until all the interviews are complete. This is very hard. Sometimes you get an all-star who you just interviewed. They walk out the room and you all look at each other and you want to say, "Jose's perfect. He's it. We need to make him an offer right now." Really want to encourage you to hold off on that. And it's because someone might not agree. Someone on the interview committee might have picked up on something or heard something that they want to share with the group that they think is of concern and should be talked about. And when everyone is excited about the candidate and everyone shares they think they're the one, it's less likely that that person is going to share that opinion. And you really want your spaces to be open spaces where the committee can speak openly about what they heard, what their thoughts are related to the job position, related to the questions and the answers that were provided. Next slide, please. Oh, did we pass 20? I'm sorry.
We did, but 20 was put in an error. So we're right on track.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you for that, Jose. So, throughout the process, we have between the RCD and even the Office of Leadership Development, we have mechanisms in place that will help your committees, work through your process of hiring. So we can support with applicant generation if there just aren't enough applicants for an individual position. We have interview question banks that can be used. There's certainly hiring rubrics and scoring forms. And we have training and support, right, for hiring committees, which is happening right now. Next slide. All right, so So you've done all of this work with hiring folks for your schools, and but you don't want them to walk away right after a year or two. So retaining, these high quality, staff and educators and even school leaders that you've just hired, is also very, very important. All right. So I'd like to just take a moment to allow anyone in the chat box or turning on their mic to think about, how your schools might do that. I mean, how do you think your schools, can develop, a culture that feels inclusive and, culturally sustaining, for our staff, especially for our staff of color. All right. And maybe there are some things that you feel like your schools are doing well or have tried, in terms of retaining employees of a diverse backgrounds. We have a number of programs that we run at the central office level, especially our Atlanta programming that seeks to bring together our educators of color from across the district. On at least a monthly basis, just for socialization and and connectivity and a sense of belonging. But we know it's important to have it in the school buildings, because that's where your educators live every single day. So any thoughts in terms of retention efforts? Either things that you've seen that have gone well, or what you think your school might be currently doing, or what your schools could do?
Hi, I would say that increase transparency, and if there's let's say projects that are being worked on the community, on the boards that they have, letting know families and teachers, this is our goals. This is what we're working on. Please share your thoughts. Having comment boxes, I think it helps. And just informing parents and sharing of opportunities that may come so we can continue. We never stop learning from one another and educating others in general. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. That's wonderful feedback. Anyone else?
Yeah, hi, my name is Celeste. I guess I don't have a solution, but I guess I just want to name I'm a BPS employee, but I'm also a BPS parent for many years. And it feels like obviously there's a piece that's the hiring committee or the school's job. And there's a big piece that's BPS central office's job in terms of thinking about what it means to bring in educators from different places, principals from different places who don't necessarily know our community. And also just thinking about like the larger systems issues of like the way the system is set up to support or not support principals and the things that they're asked to do, and just some of the silos of departments in the district and things like that. So I guess I just want to name that it feels like a very large systems issue, this issue of retention of leadership, of quality leadership in our district.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm glad you named that, and certainly something that I think the district is committed to working at, and more certainly has to be done. So thank you for bringing that up. Anyone else before we go on? Yeah. And we have a couple of things in the chat box here. So Aaron says that intentional cultivation, people want to stay in places when their growth is invested in with time, attention, expertise and resources. Yes, we hear a lot about wanting resources, feeling supportive, high quality professional development. Making sure employees feel valued and providing a safe space where one feels comfortable enough, where they feel they can share their ideas and know they will be heard and not dismissed. Yeah, that is very, very important, Nicole. Thank you for sharing that. All right, and then Jose does have to depart. We thank Jose for for his work, and he says for his contributions. All right. And Erica says establish and enforce policies that support cultural diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yes, absolutely. And we're blessed that our district and our superintendent has remained committed to the district's work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, in spite of the current circumstances in our country. All right, let's go on the next couple of slides. Thank you all for sharing. Anything else that we throw into the chat box, unless there's somebody else who wants to say something. just check and make sure.
I have a
Go on,
question.
please.
Sorry,
Yep.
I have a question regarding a
Jelly.
couple slides earlier when you spoke about accommodations.
Mm.
And you also spoke about the process being the same for everyone, making sure that we're being cautious about that. If a person asks for accommodations, as in, can you send me the questions ahead of time? Should we send them to everyone ahead of time in terms of making sure that we standardize our process?
Well, I would say probably so, but that would be something that, if you're gonna, if that's the type of practice, that the committee set aside, that probably would be something that you would, that you probably would decide in advance, right?
Okay.
I mean, because, you really can't get to the third interviewer, right? Or interviewee, and they ask for the questions, right? Well, the first two people have already been interviewed, right? So they
Okay.
didn't get the questions in advance. All right. Yeah. So I think when you think of people, reaching out to the, accommodations office, maybe they need an interpreter, right? Maybe they need ASL support, right? Just sort of things that the school can't provide, but the district can, right? And we want to be sure that that the schools know that if they feel like their candidates need an accommodation or support in order to access the process equitably, that we want them to be able to reach out to have us figure that out.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, next slide.
Rashawn, before we move
Yeah, sure.
you have a question in the
Oh,
question.
sorry.
No,
Yeah,
no
go on.
worries. And the question is, does BPS vet the resumes we review from a racial/ethnic perspective?
Well, the short answer is is no. I mean, so what we do is we provide everyone with an opportunity to self-identify their racial preference, right? Or identity. And then obviously we also give you the opportunity to decline. All right. But in that information, about a candidate's, racial identity, is always available, right? I mean, look, we're a non-discriminatory, district, so we're not going to initially screen, for anything around race, but we do track the data. So we'll always be able to share, which we share publicly, how many diverse applicants, that we had into a given school. All right. And that's also, information that, that school leaders, have access to. Like if you literally just want to know, how many applicants of color you have in your pool, that is, that's information that's available. All right. So finally, so on top of that, so these are just some of the retention programs and services that our office, the RCD, provides for all of our educators, especially for our educators of color. So like I said, we have this Alana Network program, most of them sponsored by our partners, where we bring people together to get resources in safe, in safe spaces. We actually have one this week on Thursday, being hosted by our partners over at the BU Wheelock College of Education. There's a school leaders network, of color network. We have affinity groups, both at the central office, and we support school-based affinity groups. Yeah, for people to get together to celebrate and to connect. We're certainly always thinking about licensure, and then we have this monthly newsletter that we send out for our educators of color that come to my office. We have a ton of degree completion programs because people are always looking for opportunities to further their education. And then we try to do exit interviews, or at least people who want to participate in our survey, so we can get an understanding of your experience. Next slide. Our retention programs and services. So these are all of our schools, and these are available even, for you guys to tap into as folks connected to the BPS. I mean, primarily we're looking to support BPS employees, or even, the adult, children of their employees. But we want people to be able to get the degrees, to get the licenses and further education, that they need. And so we negotiated all of these partnerships from our local area colleges and universities who are providing steep, discounts and special scholarships, in all these different degree areas. So we're really proud of, of that partnership work that we have created. All right, next slide. All right, and then that's it. So I thank you all, for joining us, and I think